I'm Alex, a college student in Chicago who survived the first week of the Ice Age apocalypse. One day our world froze over, temperatures plummeted, snow buried the city, and chaos erupted. I fought to stay alive as food vanished, power failed, and people turned desperate. This is my story of survival against nature and humanity's darkest impulses. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. It's hard to believe that just a week ago I was a normal college student, worried about midterms and what to eat for dinner. Now I'm huddled in a frozen subway station, surrounded by strangers, fighting for survival in a world that's become a frozen wasteland. My name is Alex, and this is my story of how I survived the first week of the Ice Age apocalypse. Let me take you back to where it all began. It was mid-October in Chicago, and fall was in full swing. The leaves were changing colors, and there was a crisp chill in the air. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except maybe it was a bit colder than usual for this time of year. I remember walking to class that Tuesday morning, pulling my jacket tighter around me as a particularly frigid gust of wind cut through the campus quad. As I hurried to my first lecture of the day, I overheard a couple of professors talking near the science building. One of them, Dr. Reeves from the meteorology department, seemed concerned. "These temperature readings aren't making any sense," he was saying. "It's like the jet stream has completely shifted overnight." The other professor shrugged it off, joking about how Chicago weather was always unpredictable. If only we had known how right Dr. Reeves was to be worried. Throughout the day, the temperature continued to drop. By the time my last class ended at 5 o'clock, it was already below freezing. Snow had started to fall, which wasn't too unusual for Chicago in October, but something about it felt different. The flakes were smaller, almost crystalline, and they seemed to multiply at an alarming rate. As I trudged back to my dorm, I noticed a group of squirrels frantically burying acorns in the campus green. It struck me as odd because they seemed almost panicked, working with a feverish intensity I'd never seen before. Looking back, I realized those little guys knew something was coming long before we did. That night, my roommate Jake and I ordered pizza and settled in to watch some Netflix. The wind was howling outside, rattling our windows. "Man, sounds like a big storm coming," Jake said, glancing nervously at the window. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of unease. "Yeah, maybe we should stock up on some snacks tomorrow just in case we get snowed in for a day or two," I suggested. We laughed it off, never imagining how prescient that casual comment would turn out to be. As we were getting ready for bed, I noticed a news alert on my phone. The National Weather Service had issued a severe winter storm warning for the entire Midwest. The meteorologist on screen looked unusually grave as he advised everyone to stay indoors and prepare for record-breaking low temperatures. Jake and I exchanged worried glances but tried to reassure each other. "It's probably just another overblown weather report," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Jake. "We'll wake up tomorrow and everything will be fine." I've never been so wrong in my life. The next morning I woke up to Jake shaking me frantically. "Alex, wake up, you've got to see this." I stumbled out of bed, disoriented and groggy. As soon as I looked out the window, all traces of sleep vanished. The world outside was white, not just snow-covered, but completely, utterly white. The snow was piled so high it reached halfway up our third-floor window. "What the hell?" I muttered, pressing my face against the cold glass. The street below was completely buried. Cars were nothing more than vague lumps under the snow. The trees in the quad, which had been full of colorful autumn leaves just yesterday, were now bare and coated in a thick layer of ice. Jake was frantically scrolling through his phone. "It's not just us," he said, his voice shaking. "It's everywhere. New York, Los Angeles, even Florida. The whole country is frozen." I grabbed my own phone, and my heart sank as I saw dozens of missed calls and texts from my parents. With trembling fingers, I dialed their number, silently praying they would pick up. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, each unanswered ring increasing my panic. "No signal," Jake said, tossing his phone onto his bed in frustration. "The cell networks must be overloaded." We turned on the TV, desperate for information. Every channel was broadcasting the same emergency message. "A sudden and severe Arctic weather system has engulfed the entire North American continent. All citizens are advised to stay indoors and conserve resources. Please remain calm and await further instructions." Calm? How could we remain calm? The world as we knew it had literally frozen overnight. A pounding on our door made us both jump. It was Sarah, a girl from down the hall. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Have you guys seen what's happening? The pipes in our bathroom burst. There's water everywhere and it's turning to ice." We followed her down the hall and sure enough, the bathroom was a disaster. Water was gushing from a broken pipe, instantly freezing as it hit the air. The floor was a sheet of ice, and icicles were forming on the sink and shower curtain. "We need to tell the RA," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But as we made our way to the resident advisor's room, we realized the scope of the problem was far beyond anything a college student could handle. The entire dorm was in chaos. Students were running up and down the halls, some crying, others shouting into their phones, trying in vain to reach their families. The power was flickering on and off, and the heating system was groaning as it struggled against the plummeting temperatures. Our RA, Mike, was standing in the hallway, looking completely overwhelmed. When he saw us approaching, he held up his hands. "Before you ask, I don't know anything more than you do. The university administration is trying to coordinate with local authorities, but everything's a mess. For now, everyone needs to stay in their rooms and try to stay warm." As we turned to go back to our room, a loud crack echoed through the building, followed by the sound of shattering glass. Someone screamed. We rushed to the common room to find that the large picture window had shattered under the weight of the snow and ice. Frigid air and snow were pouring in, turning the room into a winter cave in a matter of minutes. "Everyone, get blankets, towels, anything we can use to block this up," I shouted, surprising myself with how quickly I shifted into action. Students scrambled to follow my instructions, and soon we had a makeshift barrier of fabric and furniture blocking the broken window. As we worked, I couldn't help but wonder, if this was happening in our dorm, what was going on in the rest of the city, the rest of the world? How long would this last? And most importantly, how were we going to survive? Little did I know, these questions would become the least of our worries as the day wore on. The true test of our survival was just beginning, and the frozen world outside was only the first of many challenges we would face in the coming days. The rest of that first day passed in a blur of frantic activity and growing dread. The university administration finally managed to get a message to us through the emergency alert system. Classes were canceled indefinitely, and we were instructed to shelter in place. They promised that supplies would be distributed, but given the state of the roads, no one knew when that might actually happen. As night fell, the temperature continued to drop. The dorm's heating system, pushed beyond its limits, finally gave out with a wheezing groan. The darkness outside seemed to press in on us, broken only by the eerie blue-white glow of the snow and ice. Jake and I huddled in our room, wrapped in every blanket we owned. We had pushed our beds together for warmth and invited Sarah to join us. None of us wanted to be alone. "Do you think this is it?" Sarah whispered in the darkness. "The end of the world?" I wanted to reassure her, to say that of course it wasn't, that help would come and everything would go back to normal, but the words stuck in my throat, because the truth was I didn't know. And as I lay there, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling the cold seep into my bones, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world as we knew it had already ended. As the first rays of dawn filtered through our frost-covered window, I realized I had barely slept. The events of the previous day felt like a nightmare, but the biting cold and the eerie silence outside confirmed that our new frozen reality was all too real. Jake, Sarah, and I untangled ourselves from our nest of blankets, our breath visible in the frigid air of our dorm room. We were stiff, cold, and hungry, but mostly we were scared. The world had changed overnight, and we had no idea what to expect. I fumbled for my phone, hoping against hope that I'd have a signal. To my surprise, I did, but it was weak and intermittent. Immediately, I tried calling my parents again. This time, the call connected, but the line was full of static. "Mom? Dad? Can you hear me?" I shouted into the phone. My mom's voice came through, broken and distorted. "Alex? Oh, thank God. Are you safe?" "I'm okay, Mom. We're in the dorm. What's happening there?" "It's bad, sweetie. The power's out. Your father, trying to keep warm." The line crackled and went dead. I stared at my phone for how long? And how could I help them when I was trapped here? Jake put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "At least you got through. I still can't reach my folks." We turned on the TV, hoping for more information. Most channels were static, but we finally found a news broadcast. The images were shocking. Chicago, normally a bustling metropolis, was a ghost town. The iconic skyline was barely visible through the swirling snow. The streets were empty, except for abandoned cars buried under drifts. Lake Michigan had frozen solid. The waves stopped mid-crest in a bizarre icy sculpture. The news anchor, looking haggard and sleep-deprived, was reporting from what looked like a makeshift studio. "The sudden onset of this unprecedented cold snap has paralyzed much of North America," she said. "Temperatures have plummeted to levels never before recorded. Scientists are baffled by the rapid change, with some speculating about a sudden shift in global weather patterns." As she spoke, images flashed across the screen. New York City's Times Square, empty and white. Palm trees in Miami Beach sagging under the weight of snow. Even the typically scorching Death Valley was blanketed in white. "The president has declared a state of emergency across all 50 states. The anchor continued. "The military has been mobilized to assist in relief efforts, but the extreme conditions are hampering their progress. Citizens are advised to stay indoors, conserve heat and food, and await further instructions." Sarah hugged herself tightly. "Further instructions? From who? It doesn't look like anyone out there knows what to do either." She was right. As we watched, it became clear that this disaster had caught everyone off guard. The government, the military, even the scientists. No one seemed to have anticipated anything like this. A knock at our door startled us. It was Mike, our RA, looking even more frazzled than he had yesterday. "Hey guys, we're having an emergency meeting in the common room in 10 minutes. Spread the word, okay?" We nodded and started knocking on doors ourselves, rousing our fellow students from their cold, restless sleep. As we gathered in the common room, I was struck by how different everyone looked. Gone were the carefree college students of just 2 days ago. The faces around me were drawn, worried, and afraid. Mike stood at the front of the room, trying to project an air of calm authority. "Okay, everyone, here's what we know. The university is working with local authorities to get us supplies, but it's going to take time. The roads are impassable, and they're having trouble keeping vehicles running in this cold. In the meantime, we need to take stock of what we have and ration it carefully." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. Mike held up his hands for silence. "I know it's scary, but we're all in this together. We need to look out for each other now. I need volunteers to help me do a room-by-room inventory of food, water, and warm clothing." I stepped forward, along with Jake and a few others. As we moved through the dorm, the gravity of our situation became clearer. Some students had stashes of snacks or cases of ramen, but others had almost nothing. We found a few cases of bottled water in the vending machine room and some canned goods in the small kitchenette on our floor. It wasn't much for a building full of people. As we worked, I couldn't help but think about all the times I'd complained about the dining hall food or splurged on takeout instead. If only I'd known how precious every morsel of food would become. By the time we finished the inventory, my stomach was growling and I felt lightheaded from hunger. We hadn't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Mike divided up what little food we had, giving each person a small ration. As I bit into a stale granola bar, I savored every crumb, knowing it might be hours before I ate again. The day wore on, and the cold seemed to intensify. We huddled in the common room, sharing body heat and what few blankets we had. The power continued to flicker on and off, each outage lasting longer than the last. We knew it was only a matter of time before it failed completely. As afternoon turned to evening, restlessness began to set in. Some students were talking about trying to leave to make their way home or to find help. Mike tried to dissuade them, reminding them of the dangerous conditions outside, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He was just as scared and uncertain as the rest of us. Just as arguments were starting to break out, we heard a sound that made us all freeze. It was a loud crack, followed by a deep, groaning sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the building. "What was that?" someone whispered. Before anyone could answer, there was another crack, louder this time, and the floor beneath us shuddered. "Everyone out!" Mike shouted. "The building's shifting!" Panic erupted as we all The power chose that moment to cut out completely, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed Sarah's hand and felt Jake's grip on my shoulder as we stumbled down the steps, guided only by the weak light of a few cell phones. As we burst out of the front doors, the full force of the cold hit us like a physical blow. The wind whipped snow into our faces, and the temperature must have been well below zero, but we couldn't go back inside. Even as we watched, cracks were appearing in the walls of our dorm, spreading like spider webs across the brick. "The weight of the ice," I heard someone say. "It's too much for the building to handle." We stood there, shivering and in shock, as our home for the past months groaned and shifted. Where would we go? How would we survive out here in the open? As if in answer to our unspoken questions, we heard a sound in the distance. It was faint at first, barely audible over the howling wind, but it grew louder, a steady thump-thump thump that I recognized even before I saw the source. A helicopter appeared over the tops of the snow-laden trees, its searchlight cutting through the swirling snow. For a moment, hope surged through me. Help had arrived. We were saved. But as the helicopter drew closer, I realized something was wrong. It was flying erratically, dipping and swaying in the fierce wind. We watched in horror as it struggled to maintain altitude, the pilot clearly fighting for control. The searchlight swept over us, illuminating our huddled group for a brief moment. I waved my arms frantically, shouting even though I knew they couldn't hear me. The helicopter seemed to steady for a moment, turning towards us. Then, with a sickening lurch, it began to spin. The rotors screamed as they fought against the ice forming on their blades. Time seemed to slow as we watched the aircraft spiral downward, disappearing behind the buildings of the campus. A few seconds later, we heard the crash. A plume of black smoke rose into the white sky, quickly swallowed by the swirling snow. The silence that followed was deafening. Our last hope of immediate rescue had literally gone up in smoke. We were on our own. "We need to find shelter," Mike said, his voice shaking but determined. "We can't stay out here and we can't go back in there." He nodded towards our crumbling dorm. "But where can we go?" Sarah asked, her teeth chattering. I looked around, trying to think. The entire campus was in the same state as our dorm, buildings groaning under the weight of snow and ice, windows shattered, doors frozen shut. Then I remembered something from my campus tour, way back when I first came to look at the university. "The old steam tunnels," I said. "There's a network of tunnels under the campus. They used to use them to distribute steam for heating, but now they mostly use them for data cables and stuff. They might be our best shot." Mike nodded. "Good thinking, Alex. Does anyone know how to access them? I racked my brain, trying to remember the offhand comment our tour guide had made. I think there's an entrance near the library, in the basement. It wasn't much to go on, but it was all we had. As a group, we began to move across the campus, fighting against the wind and snow. The going was tough. The snow was knee-deep in places, and the wind threatened to knock us off our feet. As we struggled towards the library, I couldn't help but wonder, even if we found these tunnels, what then? How long could we survive down there? And what would we find when we eventually emerged? The frozen world around us offered no answers, only the constant biting reminder that our fight for survival was just beginning. The journey to the library was like nothing I'd ever experienced. Every step was a battle against the wind and snow. The cold cut through our clothes, numbing our skin and seeping into our bones. I could feel my eyelashes freezing together, and each breath was painful, the frigid air burning my lungs. As we trudged through the white wasteland that had once been our familiar campus, I couldn't help but think of all the times I'd walked this path before. Just days ago, these sidewalks had been filled with students rushing to class, laughing with friends, living normal lives. Now, it was a frozen ghost town, silent except for the howling wind and the crunch of our footsteps in the snow. We finally reached the library, its grand facade now an imposing wall of ice and snow. The main entrance was completely blocked, buried under a massive snowdrift. Mike, our RA who had taken charge of our group, pointed to a narrow window at ground level. "There," he shouted over the wind. "That's our way in." Jake and I worked together to clear the snow away from the window. The glass was frosted over, but miraculously intact. With trembling hands, I tried to pry it open, but it was frozen shut. "We have to break it," I said, looking around for something to use. Sarah stepped forward. She was clutching a heavy textbook she must have grabbed before we evacuated. Without a word, she swung it at the window. The glass cracked, but didn't shatter. "Again," Mike urged. Sarah hit it once more, and this time the window gave way with a crash. Cold air rushed out of the opening, but it was noticeably warmer than outside. One by one, we climbed through the broken window, helping each other down into what turned out to be the library's basement. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw rows of bookshelves and storage boxes. The air was musty and stale, but blessedly still compared to the howling wind outside. Mike did a quick head count. There were about 30 of us who had made it this far. I looked at the faces around me. Some I knew, others I'd only ever seen in passing in the dorm hallways. We were all in this together now. "Okay," Mike said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "We need to find the entrance to those tunnels. Alex, any idea where to look?" I shook my head. "I'm not sure. The tour guide just mentioned they were down here somewhere." We spread out, searching the basement for any sign of a hidden entrance. I ran my hands along the walls, looking for any irregularities, any hint of a secret door. The minutes ticked by, and I could feel the desperation growing in the group. We couldn't stay here indefinitely. It was warmer than outside, but still far too cold to survive for long. Just as I was starting to lose hope, I heard Jake call out from across the room. "Guys, I think I found something." We all rushed over. Jake was standing in front of what looked like an old maintenance door, half hidden behind a shelf of outdated encyclopedias. The door was metal, covered in rust and cobwebs. A faded sign above it read, "Authorized personnel only." Mike tried the handle, but it was locked. "Anyone know how to pick a lock?" he asked, looking around hopefully. To my surprise, Sarah stepped forward again. She pulled a bobby pin from her hair and bent down to examine the lock. "I used to lock myself out of my house all the time," she explained, working the pin into the keyhole. "My dad taught me how to do this so he wouldn't have to keep leaving work to let me in." We all watched in tense silence as Sarah worked. After what felt like an eternity, there was a soft click, and the door swung open with a rusty groan. Beyond, the door was a narrow passageway disappearing into darkness. A wave of stale, warm air washed over us. The steam tunnels. We'd found them. Mike pulled out his phone, using it as a makeshift flashlight. "All right, everyone stay close. We don't know what condition these tunnels are in or where they lead." We filed into the tunnel, the darkness swallowing us as we moved away from the basement. The air was humid and had a slightly metallic taste. Pipes ran along the walls and ceiling, some hissing softly with escaping steam. It was significantly warmer down here, and I felt my frozen limbs start to tingle painfully as they thawed. As we walked, I tried to orient myself based on what I knew of the campus layout above. "I think we're heading towards the science building," I said, my voice sounding strange in the enclosed space. We came to a junction, the tunnel branching off in 3 directions. Mike paused, looking uncertain for the first time since we'd left the dorm. "Which way?" he asked. Before anyone could answer, we heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a low rumble, growing louder by the second. The pipes around us began to rattle. "Earthquake?" someone whispered fearfully, but I knew it wasn't an earthquake. The sound was familiar. I'd heard it just before we evacuated the dorm. It was the sound of a building collapsing under the weight of ice and snow. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her down the right-hand tunnel. I didn't know if it was the right direction, but instinct told me to get as far away from the library as possible. We ran blindly through the darkness, the rumbling growing louder behind us. I could hear screams and the thunder of footsteps as the others followed. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning. Just when I thought my lungs would burst, we burst through another door and found ourselves in a large, open space. As our eyes adjusted, I realized we were in some kind of underground storage area. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes and equipment. A few emergency lights cast a weak glow, powered by what must have been a backup generator. We all stood there, panting and shaking as the rumbling finally subsided. Mike did another head count, his face grim. "We're missing 5 people," he said quietly. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a punch to the gut. 5 of our classmates, possibly buried alive or trapped in the collapsing tunnels, and we couldn't go back for them. The way we'd come was almost certainly blocked now. Exhaustion hit me like a wave. We'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, fighting for survival in a world that had turned hostile overnight. I slumped against a shelf, my legs giving out beneath me. Jake sat down next to me, his face pale and drawn. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for him. We were safe for the moment, but for how long? We had no food, no water, and no idea what was happening in the world above us. The sound of quiet sobs echoed through the room as the reality of our situation sank in. Mike cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "We need to rest," he said, "but we also need to explore this place, see what resources we have. Any volunteers to help me look around?" A few people raised their hands, including Sarah. As they set off to search the storage area, I leaned my head back against the shelf, closing my eyes. Despite my exhaustion, sleep felt impossible. Every time I started to drift off, I jolted awake, my mind replaying the terrifying events of the past day. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, Jake was shaking me. "Awake. Alex, wake up. They found something." I blinked, disoriented. The emergency lights had dimmed further, making it hard to see. How long had I been asleep? My whole body ached, and my stomach cramped with hunger. Mike and the others who had gone exploring were gathered in the center of the room. As Jake and I joined them, I saw what had caused the excitement. They had found a cache of emergency supplies, bottles of water, energy bars, first aid kits, and even some battery-powered lanterns. "It looks like this was set up as some kind of emergency shelter," Mike explained. "There's not enough here for long-term survival, but it'll keep us going for a few days at least." As Mike started to distribute the supplies, Sarah pulled me aside. "Alex, we found something else," she said in a low voice. "A radio. It's old, but it seems to be working. We've been trying to pick up any broadcasts." My heart leapt. "Did you hear anything?" Sarah's face fell. "Just static mostly, but there was something. It was faint and broken up, but we think we heard a voice." "What did it say?" I asked eagerly. "We're not sure," Sarah admitted, "but it sounded like they were talking about a safe zone, something about the military setting up shelters." A spark of hope flared in my chest. If there were safe zones, if the military was organizing relief efforts, then maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe we just had to hold out long enough to be rescued. But as I looked around at our ragtag group huddled in this underground room, I knew that holding out wouldn't be easy. We had survived the first 24 hours of this Ice Age apocalypse, but the real test was still to come. As I accepted a bottle of water and an energy bar from Mike, I couldn't help but wonder what was happening out there in the frozen world. Were my parents still alive? And how long would it be before help reached us, if it ever did? The low hum of the backup generator and the occasional drip of water from the pipes above were the only sounds as we all sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The weight of our situation pressed down on us, as heavy as the ice and snow that had buried our world. I took a small sip of water, savoring it. Who knew when we'd find more? As I glanced around at the faces of my fellow survivors, I saw the same mix of fear, exhaustion, and determination that I felt. We had made it this far against all odds. Now we just had to figure out how to keep surviving one day at a time in this new frozen reality. The energy bar tasted like sawdust in my mouth, but I forced myself to eat it slowly, knowing my body desperately needed the calories. As I chewed, I found myself thinking about all the things I'd taken for granted just days ago. A warm bed, a hot shower, the ability to open my fridge and choose from a variety of foods. Now those simple comforts seemed like impossible luxuries. Mike's voice broke through my thoughts. "We need to come up with a plan," he said, addressing the group. "We can't stay down here forever. We need to find out what's happening up there and see if we can make contact with any rescue operations." There were murmurs of agreement, but also fear. The idea of venturing back out into that frozen wasteland was terrifying, but we all knew Mike was right. We couldn't just hide and hope for rescue. We had to take action. "I'll go," I heard myself say, surprising even myself. I'll go up and scout around. Jake immediately volunteered to come with me, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah did too. Mike nodded, looking relieved. Okay, but be careful. Take some of the emergency supplies and don't stay out too long. If you're not back in 2 hours, we'll assume the worst. As we prepared for our scouting mission, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to step. What would we find up there? And more importantly, what would we do if there was no help coming? With heavy hearts and trembling hands, we made our way towards the exit, ready to face whatever this new ice age had in store for us. As Jake, Sarah, and I prepared to venture out into the frozen world above, the gravity of our situation hit me anew. We were about to step into a landscape that had become alien and hostile in a matter of days. The familiar campus we once knew was now buried under who knows how many feet of snow and ice. We layered up as best we could with whatever warm clothing we had managed to grab during our hasty evacuation. Mike handed each of us a backpack filled with some of the emergency supplies we'd found: water, energy bars, a first aid kit, and one of the battery-powered lanterns. Remember, Mike said as we stood by the exit, 2 hours. If you're not back by then, we'll have to assume. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all knew the risks. With a final nod to our fellow survivors, we pushed open the heavy metal door that led to the surface. A blast of frigid air hit us immediately, stealing our breath away. We stepped out into what looked like a scene from another planet. The world was white, blindingly, oppressively white. Snow covered everything in sight, smoothing out the landscape into unrecognizable lumps and drifts. The sky was a uniform gray, making it impossible to tell what time of day it was. The wind howled around us, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. "My God," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. We stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight before us. Then, remembering our mission, we started to move forward, trudging through snow that came up to our knees. Our progress was painfully slow. Every step was a struggle against the deep snow and the relentless wind. I tried to orient myself to figure out where we were on campus, but everything looked so different under its blanket of white. "Look," Jake said suddenly, pointing to our right. "I think that's the science building." I squinted in the direction he was pointing. At first, all I could see was more snow, but then I made out a vague shape rising from the white expanse. As we got closer, I realized Jake was right. It was the science building, or what was left of it. The roof had caved in under the weight of the snow, and one entire wall had collapsed outward. "Do you think anyone was in there when it happened?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. I didn't answer. I couldn't bear to think about it. We continued on, making our way towards what we thought was the center of campus. The going was tough, and I could feel my strength ebbing with each step. The cold was relentless, seeping through our layers of clothing and numbing our extremities. As we approached the main quad, we saw something that made us all stop in our tracks. Rising from the snow was a hand, a human hand, frozen solid and reaching up as if grasping for help that never came. Sarah turned away, retching. Jake put a comforting hand on her shoulder, but I could see he was as shaken as she was. I stared at the hand, unable to look away. Who was it? A student? A professor? Someone who had been caught outside when the temperature plummeted? "We should keep moving," I said finally, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. We pressed on, but now every step felt like we were walking through a graveyard. How many more bodies were buried beneath the snow we were trudging through? As we neared the center of campus, we heard a sound that made us all freeze. It was a low rumble growing louder by the second. We'd heard that sound before, just before the library collapsed. "Run!" I shouted, but even as the word left my mouth, I knew it was useless. There was nowhere to run to, nowhere to take shelter. The ground began to shake beneath our feet. Cracks appeared in the snow around us, spreading like spider webs. And then, with a deafening roar, the earth seemed to open up. I felt myself falling, tumbling through darkness. Snow and ice rained down around me. I hit something hard and then everything went black. When I came to, I was surrounded by darkness. For a moment, I thought I had gone blind. Then I remembered the lantern in my backpack. With shaking hands, I fumbled it out and switched it on. The weak light revealed that I was in some kind of underground space. Broken concrete and twisted metal surrounded me. I realized I must have fallen into one of the university's underground parking garages when the ground collapsed. "Jake? Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. To my immense relief, I heard a groan nearby. Swinging my lantern around, I saw Jake pushing himself up from a pile of snow and debris. "I'm okay," he said, though he winced as he moved. "Where's Sarah?" We called out for her, our voices bouncing off the concrete walls. There was no response. Then we heard a faint voice. "Over here, I'm stuck." We scrambled towards the sound, clambering over fallen chunks of concrete and twisted car frames. We found Sarah pinned under a large piece of debris, her leg trapped. "Are you hurt?" I asked. kneeling beside her. She shook her head. I don't think so. Just stuck. Jake and I worked together to lift the debris off her leg. It was heavy, and our frozen fingers struggled to find purchase, but finally we managed to free her. As Sarah stood up, testing her leg gingerly, I looked around our new surroundings. The parking garage was in bad shape. Parts of the ceiling had caved in, letting in snow and frigid air, but it was still more sheltered than the surface. We can't go back the way we came, Jake said, voicing what we were all thinking. The hole we had fallen through was far above us, and even if we could reach it, it was clogged with snow and debris. Maybe there's another way out, Sarah suggested. These garages usually have multiple exits, right? It was as good a plan as any. We started to make our way through the garage, our lantern casting long shadows as we went. The place was eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional groan of settling concrete or the whistle of wind through the gaps in the ceiling. As we walked, I couldn't help but think about the others back in the storage room. Had they felt the collapse? Did they think we were dead? And even if we found a way out of here, how would we find our way back to them? We had been walking for what felt like hours when Jake suddenly stopped. Do you guys hear that? We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I heard nothing but the wind. Then I caught it, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound. It sounds like a heartbeat, Sarah whispered, but I knew it wasn't a heartbeat. It was too regular, too mechanical, and it was getting louder. It's an engine, I said, realization dawning. Someone's down here with us. We quickened our pace, following the sound. As we rounded a corner, we saw a faint light in the distance. Hope surged through me. Was it possible? Had we found other survivors? But as we got closer, my hope turned to fear. The light was moving, sweeping back and forth across the garage, and now I could hear voices, gruff, angry voices. Check every vehicle, one voice said. If you find any supplies, take them. If you find any survivors, well, you know what to do. We ducked behind a nearby car, our hearts pounding. Through the broken windows, I could see figures moving in the distance. They were dressed in heavy winter gear, and they were armed. Who are they? Sarah whispered. I shook my head. They weren't military or any kind of official rescue team, that much was clear. These were scavengers, maybe even bandits, taking advantage of the chaos to loot whatever they could find. We huddled there, barely daring to breathe. As the group moved closer to our hiding spot, I could see now that there were 5 of them, each carrying a rifle and a large backpack. Nothing here, one of them called out. This level's picked clean. All right, the leader responded. Let's move up to the next level. Be careful though, that last tremor might have weakened the structure. We waited, hardly daring to move, until the sound of their footsteps and voices faded away. Only then did we let out the breath we'd been holding. We need to get out of here, Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. If they come back, I nodded. But we can't go back the way we came. They'll see us for sure. What about down? Sarah suggested. This can't be the lowest level of the garage. Maybe we can find a way out through the bottom. It was risky. The lower we went, the more danger there was of flooding or cave-ins. But with armed looters above us, we didn't have much choice. We found a stairwell and started to descend. The air grew colder and damper as we went down. When we reached the bottom level, we found ourselves wading through icy water that came up to our knees. The pipes must have burst, I said, trying to keep my teeth from chattering. We need to find a way out fast or we'll freeze to death down here. We sloshed through the flooded garage, our lights reflecting off the black water. Every car we passed was a potential hiding place for who knows what. The silence down here was oppressive, broken only by the splash of our movements and the steady drip of water from above. Just when I was starting to think we'd made a terrible mistake coming, down here Sarah spotted something. Look, over there! She was pointing to a sign on the far wall. As we got closer, I could make out the words, emergency exit. We hurried towards it, hope giving us renewed energy. But as we reached the door, we found our path blocked. A large support beam had fallen, wedging itself against the door. No, Jake groaned. We were so close, but I wasn't ready to give up. If we work together, maybe we can move it. We positioned ourselves around the beam and started to push. It was heavy, and our frozen muscles screamed in protest. For a moment, it seemed impossible. Then, with a grinding sound, the beam began to move. Inch by agonizing inch, we pushed it away from the door. When there was finally enough space, Sarah squeezed through and pushed the door open from the other side. A blast of cold air hit us, but it was fresh air. We had found a way out. As we stumbled out into the open, I realized we were on the outskirts of campus, near the athletic fields. In the distance, I could see the lights of the city. They were few and far between, but they were there. Proof that not everything had been destroyed by this sudden ice age. We made it, Sarah said, her voice filled with relief and disbelief. But as I looked at the frozen wasteland stretching out before us, at the dark and silent city in the distance, I knew our ordeal was far from over. We had survived the collapse, escaped the looters, and found our way back to the surface. But now we faced an even bigger challenge, finding our way back to our friends and figuring out how to survive in this new frozen world. As we stood there catching our breath and trying to get our bearings, I couldn't help but wonder what other dangers were waiting for us out there, and how much longer could we hold out against the relentless cold and the dwindling supplies. One thing was certain, our mission to scout the surface had turned into something much more dangerous and complicated than we could have ever imagined. And as the wind howled around us, carrying the promise of another storm, I knew that every decision we made from here on out could mean the difference between survival and becoming just another frozen corpse buried beneath the snow. Standing at the edge of the athletic fields, we faced a critical decision. We needed to get back to our group in the underground storage room, but we had no idea how to find our way there from this unfamiliar part of campus. The city lights in the distance were tempting. They promised the possibility of help of other survivors, but venturing into the unknown frozen wasteland was risky, especially with night approaching. We should try to get back to the others, Jake said, voicing what we were all thinking. They'll be worried sick and we have information they need to know about those looters. Sarah nodded in agreement, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The thought of traversing the frozen campus again, possibly running into those armed scavengers, was terrifying. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly despite the cold that was seeping into my bones. Okay, let's try to retrace our steps. We know the storage room is somewhere beneath the library. If we can find the library, we might be able to find another entrance to the tunnel system. It was a long shot, but it was the best plan we had. We set off across the snow-covered fields, the wind whipping around us and carrying ice crystals that stung our faces. Every step was a struggle, the deep snow threatening to trip us up at any moment. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Maybe it was paranoia brought on by our encounter with the looters, but I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the white landscape for any sign of movement. We had been walking for what felt like hours when Sarah suddenly stopped. "Guys, look," she said, pointing to our right. At first I couldn't see what she was indicating. Then I noticed a dark shape rising from the snow. As we got closer, I realized it was the top of a street lamp barely poking out above the snow's surface. "This must be one of the campus roads," Jake said. "If we follow it, it should lead us back to the main part of campus." It was as good a plan as any. We started following the line of partially buried street lamps, using them as guideposts in the featureless white expanse. The going was slightly easier now that we had a clear path to follow, but the cold was becoming more intense as night fell. Just as I was starting to lose hope, thinking we'd never find our way back, I saw something that made my heart leap. Rising in the distance was a familiar shape, the clock tower of the university's main building. "We're almost there," I said, my voice hoarse from the cold. The library should be just past the main building, but as we got closer, my relief turned to dismay. The main building, once the proud centerpiece of our campus, was now a crumbling ruin. The clock tower listed to one side, looking like it could topple at any moment. The rest of the building had partially collapsed, with huge cracks running through the walls that were still standing. "My God," Sarah whispered. "If this is what happened to the strongest building on campus," she didn't need to finish the thought. We all knew what it meant. The tunnel system, the chances slimmer by the minute. We pressed on, picking our way carefully around the debris from the collapsed building. As we rounded the corner where the library should have been, we were met with a sight that stopped us in our tracks. Where the library had once stood was now nothing but a massive crater filled with snow and twisted metal. The entire building had been swallowed up when the ground collapsed. "No," Jake said, his voice filled with despair. "How are we going to find the others now?" I stared at the crater, my mind racing. If the library had collapsed into the tunnel system, there was a chance our friends had been buried alive. But I couldn't let myself think about that. We had to keep hoping, keep trying to find a way to reach them. "There might be another entrance," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Let's circle the crater, see if we can find any sign of the tunnels." We started making our way around the edge of the crater, careful not to get too close to the unstable ground. The wind had picked up again, howling around us and making it hard to hear each other. The light was fading fast, and I knew we didn't have much time before we'd be stumbling around in the dark. That's when I heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind. At first I thought I was imagining things, but then I saw Jake and Sarah react too. "Is that voices?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. We stood still, straining our ears. There it was, again, definitely human voices coming from somewhere nearby. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice cracking from the cold and disuse. "Is anyone there?" For a moment, there was silence. Then we heard a response, faint but clear. "Over here, we're over here." We rushed towards the sound, our exhaustion forgotten in the excitement of finding other survivors. As we rounded a pile of debris, we saw them, a small group of people, huddled near what looked like a maintenance shed. As we got closer, I recognized one of the faces. It was Dr. Reeves, the meteorology professor I had overheard talking about the strange weather patterns just days ago, before everything went to hell. "Thank God," Dr. Reeves said as we approached. We thought we were the only ones left. There were 5 of them in total. Dr. Reeves, 2 other professors I vaguely recognized, and 2 students. They looked as cold and exhausted as we felt. "We've been trying to find a way into the tunnel system," one of the other professors explained. "We know there's an entrance around here somewhere, but with all the collapses, we know where the entrance is," I said quickly. "Or at least, we know where it was, but it's buried under all this." I gestured to the crater where the library had been. Dr. Reeves nodded grimly. "We feared as much, but we can't give up. There could be people trapped down there." As we stood there, trying to figure out our next move, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the distant rumble of engines, the same sound we had heard in the parking garage. "We need to hide," I said urgently. "There are people out there, Looters or worse. They're armed and dangerous. Dr. Reeves looked alarmed but didn't argue. He quickly ushered us all into the maintenance shed. It was a tight fit with 10 of us crammed in there, but at least it provided some shelter from the wind and snow. As we huddled in the darkness, I could hear the sound of the engines growing louder. Through a crack in the shed's wall, I saw headlights sweeping across the snow-covered campus. They're looking for survivors, I whispered, but not to help them. We waited in tense silence as the vehicles drew nearer. I could hear voices now, rough and angry. They were getting closer to our hiding spot. Just when I thought they were going to discover us, there was a loud crack from somewhere in the distance. The voices outside went quiet for a moment. Then I heard someone shout, "The tower's coming down, get back to the trucks." The engines revved up and the headlights swept away. We all let out a collective breath of relief. That was too close, Jake said, his voice shaky. As the sound of the engines faded into the distance, we cautiously emerged from our hiding place. The campus was silent once again, save for the howling of the wind, but something had changed. Where the clock tower had stood, listing precariously, there was now only empty space. It must have finally given way, Dr. Reeves said, staring at the spot where the tower had been. The vibrations from their vehicles might have been the final straw. The collapse of the tower was a stark reminder of how precarious our situation was. Every building around us was a potential death trap, weakened by the extreme cold and the weight of the snow and ice. "We can't stay here," I said, looking at the group of survivors we had found. "It's not safe, and we're exposed to the elements. We need to find better shelter." One of the students asked. "We can't just abandon them." I understood her concern. Our friends were down there somewhere, possibly trapped or injured, but I also knew that we couldn't help them if we froze to death up. "Here, we'll come back," I promised. "Once we've found safe shelter and gathered more supplies, we'll come back and find a way to reach them. But right now, we need to focus on our own survival." There were reluctant nods of agreement from the group. We all knew it was the right decision, even if it felt wrong to leave. "Where should we go?" Sarah asked, looking out at the frozen wasteland that had once been our familiar campus. Dr. Reeves spoke up. "Before everything went dark, I received a message from a colleague at the National Weather Service. They were setting up emergency shelters in key locations around the city. The nearest one should be at the convention center downtown." It was a long shot. The message Dr. Reeves had received was days old now, and there was no guarantee the shelter was still operational, but it was the best lead we had. "How far is it?" I asked. "Under normal conditions, about a 2-hour walk," Dr. Reeves replied. "But in this," he gestured to the deep snow and treacherous ice, "it could take us all night," Jake finished. I looked at our group. We were all exhausted, cold, and hungry. The idea of trekking across the frozen city was daunting, but what choice did we have? "We should rest first," I suggested. "Eat something, try to warm up a bit, we'll set out at first light." Everyone agreed. We retreated back into the maintenance shed, which at least provided some shelter from the wind. We shared what little food and water we had left, each of us, taking only the smallest portions to make it last. As we huddled together for warmth, I found myself thinking about the friends we were leaving behind in the tunnels. Were they still alive down there? Had they given up hope of our return? I silently promised them that we would come back, that we wouldn't abandon them. But as I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that our journey to the convention center would be far more perilous than any of us could imagine. The frozen city was now an alien landscape full of unknown dangers, and somewhere out there, those armed looters were still roaming, searching for anything and anyone they could exploit. As the wind howled outside our flimsy shelter, I knew that our fight for survival was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The night in the maintenance shed was long and brutal. None of us slept well, constantly woken by the howling wind or the ominous creaking of ice-laden structures around us. When the faint light of dawn finally seeped through the cracks in the shed's walls, we were all more than ready to move. We gathered what meager supplies we had left and prepared to set out for the convention center. Dr. Reeves took charge, using his knowledge of the city's layout to plan our route. "We'll need to be careful," he warned. "The roads will be treacherous, and there's no telling what we might encounter along the way." As we stepped out of the shed, the full impact of the changed world hit us anew. The campus, once so familiar, was now an alien landscape of white. Buildings that had stood for decades were now crumbling ruins, their walls unable to withstand the extreme cold and the weight of the ice. We set off in single file, Dr. Reeves leading the way. The going was tough from the start. The snow was deep and hidden patches of ice threatened to send us sprawling with every step. We moved slowly, each of us lost in our own thoughts as we trudged through the silent, frozen city. As we reached the edge of the campus, we got our first real look at what had become of the city beyond. It was a scene of utter desolation. Cars were buried under snowdrifts, their outlines barely visible. Street signs and traffic lights poked out of the snow at odd angles. And everywhere, there was ice, coating every surface, hanging in massive icicles from buildings, turning the entire city into a giant, deadly sculpture. We had been walking for about an hour when we heard it, the low rumble of engines in the distance. My heart rate spiked as I remembered our encounter with the looters the day before. "Quick," I whispered urgently. "We need to hide." We scrambled for cover, ducking behind an overturned bus that was half buried in the snow snow, we huddled there, barely daring to breathe as the sound of engines grew louder. Through a gap in the snow, I could see a convoy of vehicles approaching. They were military trucks, their green paint barely visible under a layer of frost and ice. For a moment, hope surged through me. Had help finally arrived? But as the trucks drew closer, I realized something was off. The vehicles were battered and mismatched, clearly cobbled together from whatever was still operational. Standard military uniforms, but a hodgepodge of winter gear. Those aren't military, Dr. Reeves whispered, confirming my fears. They're scavengers, using military vehicles they've probably stolen or salvaged. We watched in tense silence as the convoy passed by. I could see now that the trucks were loaded with supplies, food, fuel, weapons. These people had clearly been busy looting whatever they could find. As the last truck rumbled past our hiding spot, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. In the back of the truck, huddled together and looking terrified, were people, civilians by the look of them, prisoners or slaves being transported who knows where for who knows what purpose. Once the convoy was out of sight and the sound of engines had faded, we cautiously emerged from our hiding place. The encounter had shaken all of us, driving home just how dangerous this new world had become. We need to be more careful, Jake said, voicing what we were all thinking. If those guys catch us, he didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what he meant. We pressed on, now even more wary of our surroundings. The city seemed to grow more ominous with each block we passed. Entire buildings had collapsed, creating treacherous mountains of rubble and twisted metal. More than once, we had to backtrack and find a new route when we encountered impassable obstacles. As we picked our way through the ruins of what had once been a bustling shopping district, Sarah suddenly stopped. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell silent, straining our ears. At first, I couldn't hear anything over the constant moan of the wind, but then I caught it, a faint sound like something scratching or scrabbling. "It's coming from over there," one of the students said, pointing to a partially collapsed storefront. We approached, cautiously, the sound growing louder as we got closer. It was definitely something moving, something alive. "Hello?" I called out softly. "Is someone there?" The scratching stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, without warning, something burst out of the snow-covered rubble. It was a dog, a large husky by the look of it, but this was no friendly pet. Its fur was matted and frozen, its eyes wild with hunger and fear. It growled at us, baring its teeth. We all took a step back, but the dog didn't retreat. Instead, it began to bark loudly, the sound echoing off the surrounding buildings. "We need to go," Dr. Reeves said urgently. "That barking will attract attention." But before we could move, we heard a response. Another bark, then another coming, from different directions. More dogs appeared, emerging from the ruins around us. They looked as desperate and feral as the first one. "They've formed a pack," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. "They're hunting together." We were surrounded now, a ring of snarling, hungry dogs closing in on us. I looked around frantically for an escape route, but everywhere I looked, I saw bared teeth and hungry eyes. That's when I noticed the gas station across the street. The windows were broken, but the structure looked mostly intact. "If we could just reach it." "The gas station," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "If we can get inside, we'll be safe." Dr. Reeves nodded. "Okay, everyone stay together. We're going to move slowly towards the station. No sudden movements." We began to edge towards the gas station, the dogs following our every move. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the dogs could hear it. We were about halfway there when one of the students stumbled, nearly falling. The dogs took this as a signal to attack. They lunged forward as one, snarling and snapping. "Run!" I yelled, all thoughts of moving slowly forgotten. We sprinted for the gas station, the sound of barking and panting right behind us. I reached the door first, yanking it open and holding it as the others rushed inside. Jake was the last one, in a dog snapping at his heels as he dove through the doorway. I slammed the door shut just as the pack reached it, hearing the thud of bodies hitting the other side. The dogs barked and scratched at the door, but it held firm. We all stood there, panting and shaking, as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Those dogs, probably pets just a week ago, had nearly torn us apart. "Is everyone okay?" Dr. Reeves asked, looking around at our group. There were nods all around. We were shaken, but unharmed. As our heart rates began to slow, we took stock of our surroundings. The gas station was a mess, shelves overturned and debris scattered everywhere, but it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. "We should rest here for a bit," I suggested. "Give those dogs a chance to move on." Everyone agreed. We cleared a space in the center of the store and sat down, grateful for the chance to rest our tired legs. The dogs still prowling outside. I couldn't help but think about how quickly the world had changed. Just a week ago, my biggest worry had been midterm exams. Now I was fighting for survival against against the elements, looters, and even domestic animals turned feral. "Do you think it's like this everywhere?" Sarah asked quietly, breaking the silence. Dr. Reeves sighed. "It's hard to say. This cold snap seems to be global, but its effects might vary depending on the location. Some areas might be better off, others worse. But surely someone must be doing something," one of the other professors said. "The government, the military, someone." "I'm sure they're trying," Dr. Reeves replied. "But an event of this magnitude, it's unprecedented. No one was prepared for this." As we sat there discussing the state of the world, I noticed something. The barking outside had stopped. Cautiously, I approached one of the windows and peered out. The street was empty. The dogs had moved on. "I think it's clear," I said to the others. "We should get moving. We still have a long way to go to reach the convention center." We gathered our things and prepared to head out again. As we stepped back out into the frozen world, I couldn't shake a sense of foreboding. We had survived the dogs, but what other dangers were waiting for us out there? The convention center was still several miles away, through a city that had become a frozen wasteland, and even if we made it there was no guarantee we'd find the help we so desperately needed. As we set off again, picking our way carefully through the snow-covered streets, I found myself wondering, in this new ice age, was anyone truly safe? And how long could we survive in a world that seemed determined to kill us at every turn? These questions haunted me as we pressed on, each step taking us further into the unknown. The city loomed around us, silent and menacing, holding its secrets close. What would we find as we ventured deeper into its frozen heart? Only time would tell, and time was one thing we were quickly running out of. As we continued our journey through the frozen city, the landscape became increasingly surreal. Skyscrapers that once stood proud were now encased in ice, their windows shattered by the extreme cold. Cars were abandoned in the middle of the street, some with their doors still open, as if their occupants had fled in a panic. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of our footsteps in the snow and the occasional groan of stressed metal and ice. We had been walking for hours, and fatigue was starting to set in. The cold was relentless, seeping through our layers of clothing and numbing our extremities. I could see the exhaustion on everyone's faces, the hope of reaching the convention center slowly fading with each difficult step. As we rounded a corner, we came face to face with a sight that stopped us in our tracks. A massive ice formation had engulfed an entire city block, creating a bizarre crystalline structure that sparkled eerily in the weak sunlight. It was beautiful in a terrifying way, a stark reminder of the power of this sudden ice age. "My God," Dr. Reeves breathed, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and fear. "I've never seen anything like this. The rate of ice formation is beyond anything we've ever recorded." As we stood there, marveling at the ice structure, we heard a sound that made us all freeze. It was a low rumble, growing louder by the second. At first I thought it was another vehicle, perhaps more of those scavengers we'd encountered earlier. But then I realized the sound was coming from above us. We all looked up just in time to see a massive chunk of ice break free from one of the nearby skyscrapers. It plummeted towards us, gaining speed as it fell. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her with me as I sprinted away from the falling ice. We scattered, each of us running in different directions as the ice crashed into the ground, where we had been standing just moments before. The impact sent shards of ice flying in all directions, and I felt a sharp sting as one grazed my cheek. When the dust and ice settled, I looked around frantically for the others. To my relief, I saw that everyone had managed to avoid the falling ice, but we were now separated, spread out across the intersection. "Is everyone okay?" Dr. Reeves called out, his voice echoing in the eerie silence that followed the icefall. There were shaky affirmatives from around the intersection. As we regrouped, I noticed that Jake was limping slightly. "What happened?" I asked him, concerned. He grimaced, twisted my ankle when I was running. "It's not bad, I can still walk," but I could see the pain in his eyes. This injury, however minor, could slow us down significantly, and in this environment, any delay could be deadly. Dr. Reeves seemed to be thinking the same thing. "We need to find shelter," he said, looking up at the building. "It's not safe to be out in the open like this. More ice could fall at any moment." We all agreed, the close call having shaken us all. We decided to head for a nearby department store. Its large open layout would give us space to rest and regroup, and its multiple exits would provide escape routes if needed. As we approached the store, I noticed something odd. The main entrance was barricaded, not with the haphazard debris you might expect from looters, but with carefully arranged furniture and what looked like parts of shelving units. "Someone's been here," Jake said, voicing what we were all thinking. We approached cautiously, looking for any sign of movement inside the store. The windows were frosted over, making it impossible to see inside. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent street. "Is anyone there? We're survivors, looking for shelter." For a long moment, there was no response. Then, just as we were about to try to find another way in, we heard a voice from inside. "How many of you are there?" The voice was female, wary, but not openly hostile. I looked at our group, quickly counting heads. 10, I replied. We're unarmed. We just need a place to rest and warm up. There was another pause, then the sound of furniture being moved. Slowly, the barricade at the entrance began to shift. A gap appeared, and through it, I saw a face peering out at us. It was a woman, probably in her mid-40s, with a weathered face and sharp eyes that scanned our group suspiciously. After a moment, she nodded and opened the barricade wider. "Come in," she said, "quickly before someone sees you." We didn't need to be told twice. We hurried inside, and the woman quickly closed the barricade behind us. Inside, the department store was dimly lit by battery-powered lanterns. I could see that a lot of work had gone into fortifying this place. Windows were boarded up, aisles had been rearranged to create defensible positions, and I could see stockpiles of food and water in one corner. "I'm Karen," the woman said as she led us deeper into the store. "My husband Tom and I have been holding up here since the freeze." As we walked, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Turning, I saw a man emerge from behind a makeshift barricade. He was holding a shotgun, which he lowered as Karen nodded at him. "This is Tom," Karen said. "Sorry for the caution, but we've had some unfriendly visitors lately." Dr. Reeves stepped forward, introducing our group and explaining our situation. As he talked, I saw Karen and Tom exchange a look. There was something in that look that made me uneasy, a mix of pity and, was that fear? "You're heading for the convention center?" Tom asked when Dr. Reeves had finished. There was an odd note in his voice. "Yes," I said. "We heard it was being used as an emergency shelter, is it not?" Karen and Tom exchanged another look. "It was," Karen said slowly. "At first, but things have changed." She went on to explain that in the early days of the freeze, the convention center had indeed been set up as a shelter. People had flocked there, seeking warmth and safety. But as supplies dwindled and the cold intensified, things had taken a dark turn. "The military tried to keep order at first," Tom said, his face grim, "but they were overwhelmed. There were just too many people, not enough supplies. Things got ugly fast." Karen nodded. "We left after the first week. It was chaos in there, fighting over food, over blankets. People were freezing to death and others were, well, let's just say desperate people do desperate things." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The convention center, our beacon of hope, was apparently a death trap. "But that was days ago," Dr. Reeves said, a note of desperation in his voice. "Surely things have improved since then. The government must have sent more aid." Tom shook his head. "Communication's been spotty, but from what we've heard, things have only gotten worse. The last news we got, the convention center was under the control of some kind of gang. They're hoarding supplies, controlling who gets in and out. It's not a shelter anymore, it's a fortress." The news hit us all hard. Our goal, the thing that had kept us going through all the hardships of the past few days, had just evaporated. We were back to square one, lost in a frozen city with nowhere to go. "You're welcome to stay here for the night," Karen offered, seeing our dejected faces. "It's not much, but it's warm and safe. You can decide what to do in the morning." Gratefully accepted their offer. As Karen and Tom showed us where we could set up our sleeping areas, I couldn't help but marvel at how well prepared they were. They had clearly been ready for some kind of disaster, though I doubted even they had anticipated anything like this. As we settled in for the night, I found myself unable to sleep. Kept replaying in my mind the convention. Where could we go now? What were we going to do? I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake by Jake. "Alex, wake up," he whispered urgently. "Something's happening." I sat up, instantly alert. That's when I heard it. Voices outside and the sound of engines. Lots of engines. Tom appeared, his shotgun in hand. "Everyone up," he said in a low voice. "We've got company." We all scrambled to our feet, grabbing what few possessions we had. Through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, I could see lights moving outside, vehicle headlights sweeping across the street. "Who is it?" I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew the answer. "Scavengers," Tom replied grimly, "and a lot of them. Looks like they're setting up some kind of base. Camp out there." My heart sank. We were trapped. With the scavengers outside, we couldn't leave. But how long could we stay hidden in here? And what would happen when our supplies ran out? As we huddled in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the scavengers setting up camp outside, I realized that our situation had just gone from bad to worse. We were no longer just fighting against the cold and the elements. Now, we were caught in the middle of a power struggle for what was left of our frozen world. The question now wasn't just how we would survive the cold, but how we would survive each other. As I looked around at the frightened faces of my companions, I knew that the real test of our survival was just beginning. We spent the next few hours in tense silence, listening to the activity outside. The scavengers seemed to be setting up a substantial camp with vehicles coming and going and voices calling out orders. Tom and Karen moved silently through the store, checking the barricades and occasionally whispering to each other in urgent tones. As dawn approached, Dr. Reeves gathered our group together. "We need to come up with a plan," he said in a low voice. "We can't stay here indefinitely." "But we can't go out there either," Sarah pointed out. "Those scavengers would capture us in seconds." I nodded, remembering the people we'd seen in the back of the truck earlier. "And we definitely don't want to end up as their prisoners." We all fell silent, the gravity of our situation weighing heavily on us. That's when Karen approached, her face grim. "There might be a way out," she said. "There's a service tunnel that runs under the street. It connects to the subway system. If you can get through there, you might be able to bypass the scavengers entirely." A glimmer of hope sparked in my chest, but it was quickly tempered by caution. "What's the catch?" I asked, knowing there had to be one. Karen sighed. "The tunnel's been flooded. With the extreme cold, it's probably frozen over now. It'll be like an ice cave down there. Dangerous. And once you're in, there's no guarantee you'll be able to find your way out." We all exchanged looks. It was a risk, no doubt about it, but what choice did we have? "I'll go," I said, standing up. "I'll scout it out, see if it's passable." Jake immediately stood up too. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. I wanted to argue, to tell him to stay behind where it was safer, but I knew that determined look in his eyes. There would be no talking him out of it. Karen nodded. "All right, I'll show you the entrance, but be careful down there. If you're not back in an hour, we'll have to assume—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. As we prepared to enter the tunnel, I couldn't help but think about how far we'd come from our normal lives. Just a week ago, I was a college student worried about exams. Now I was about to descend into a frozen underground tunnel, running from scavengers in a post-apocalyptic ice age. Life had become a surreal nightmare. Karen led us to a hatch in the floor of the store's storage room. As she pulled it open, a blast of frigid air hit us. I peered down into the darkness, my stomach churning with a mix of fear and anticipation. "Good luck," Karen said, handing us each a flashlight. "And hurry back." With a final nod to our friends, Jake and I began our descent into the tunnel. The metal ladder was ice cold, almost painful to touch even through our gloves. As we reached the bottom, I switched on my flashlight, and the beam illuminated a scene straight out of a winter fairy tale. If that fairy tale was written by someone with a very dark imagination. The tunnel stretched out before us, its walls and floor coated in a thick layer of ice. Icicles hung from the ceiling like crystal daggers, some as long as my arm. Our breath clouded in front of us, instantly freezing into tiny ice crystals that glittered in the beam of our flashlights. "It's beautiful," Jake whispered, his voice filled with awe despite our dire situation. I nodded, but kept my thoughts focused on our mission. "Let's keep moving. We need to find out." We moved carefully down the tunnel, our feet slipping on the icy floor. The further we went, the more treacherous it became. In some places, the ice was so thick it had changed the shape of the tunnel, creating strange, alien-like formations. We had been walking for about 20 minutes when we came to a junction. The tunnel split into 3 directions, each looking equally uninviting. "Which way?" Jake asked, shining his flashlight down each path. I was about to suggest we turn back. This maze seemed too dangerous to navigate when I noticed something, a faint glow coming from the leftmost tunnel. "Look," I said, pointing. "Is that daylight?" Jake squinted. "I think you're right, but how?" Cautiously, we made our way down the left tunnel. As we got closer, the glow became brighter. Finally, we turned a corner and found ourselves facing a wall of debris, but through the cracks, sunlight was definitely filtering through. "This must lead to the surface," I said, excitement building in my voice. "If we can clear this, we might have a way out." We began to carefully move the debris, mindful of potentially causing a cave-in. As we worked, I couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we had found our escape route. But as we removed the last of the debris, my hope turned to ash. We had indeed found an exit to the surface, but as I peered out, my heart sank. We were in the middle of the scavengers' camp. From our vantage point, I could see dozens of people moving about, all armed and looking dangerous. They had set up a perimeter of vehicles and makeshift barriers, creating a fortified base in the middle of the frozen city. "We can't go out there," Jake whispered, stating the obvious. I nodded, my mind racing. We couldn't go forward, but going back meant returning to the others with no solution. We were trapped between a rock and a very cold, hard place. That's when I saw it. Among the scavengers' vehicles was a familiar shape, a snowplow. It was battered and clearly cobbled together from various parts, but it looked operational, and more importantly, it looked like our ticket out of here. "Jake," I said, pointing to the plow, "I have an idea, but it's going to be dangerous." I quickly outlined my plan. It was risky, bordering on suicidal, but it was the only chance we had. Jake listened, his eyes widening as I spoke. "That's insane," he said when I finished. Then he grinned. "Let's do it." We made our way back through the tunnel as quickly as we could, slipping and sliding on the ice, but driven by a new sense of purpose. When we emerged back into the store, the others were waiting anxiously. "Did you find a way out?" Dr. Reeves asked as soon as he saw us. I nodded, then quickly explained what we had seen and the plan I had come up with. As I spoke, I could see the mix of fear and determination on everyone's faces. "It's risky," Tom said when I had finished. "A lot could go wrong. Everything about our situation is risky," I countered, "but this might be our only chance to get out of here." There was a moment of silence as everyone considered the plan. Then one by one, they began to nod. "All right," Karen said, her voice firm. "Let's do this." The next hour was a flurry of activity as we prepared. We gathered what supplies we could carry, created makeshift weapons from items in the store, and went over the plan again and again. As we made our final preparations, I found myself standing next to Sarah. She looked pale but determined. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. I took a deep breath. "No," I admitted, "but I'm sure that if we stay here, we're as good as dead. At least this way, we have a chance." She nodded, then surprised me by pulling me into a tight hug. "Be careful out there," she whispered. I hugged her back, suddenly acutely aware of how much I had come to care for these people who had been strangers just a week ago. We had been through so much together, and now we were about to face our biggest challenge yet. As we gathered by the tunnel entrance, ready to put our plan into action, I looked around at the faces of my companions. There was fear there, yes, but also courage and determination. Whatever happened next, we were in this together. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let's go." And with that, we descended back into the icy tunnel, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As we moved through the frozen passageway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be our last chance. If this plan failed, we might not get another opportunity. The weight of responsibility pressed down on me. This had been my idea, and if anything went wrong, it would be on my conscience. But I pushed those thoughts aside. Now wasn't the time for doubt. Now was the time for action. As we approached the exit near the scavengers' camp, I took a deep breath. This was it, the moment of truth. I looked at Jake, who nodded grimly. Then, together, the frozen world above, ready to fight for our survival once again. The moment we emerged from the tunnel, chaos erupted. Jake and I sprinted towards the snowplow, our feet slipping on the icy ground. Behind us, I could hear shouts of alarm from the scavengers as they spotted us. "Now!" I yelled, and our group burst into action. Dr. Reeves and two of the students ran in the opposite direction, creating a diversion. They threw makeshift smoke bombs we'd created from chemicals found in the department store, filling the air with thick, choking smoke. The scavengers were caught off guard, many of them coughing and stumbling in confusion. In the chaos, Jake and I reached the snowplow. I yanked open the door, thanking whatever luck we had left that it was unlocked. "Cover me!" I shouted to Jake as I climbed in and started searching for the keys. Jake stood guard, wielding a makeshift club we'd fashioned from a broken table leg. A scavenger charged towards us, but Jake swung hard, catching the man in the chest and sending him sprawling. My hands were shaking as I searched frantically for the keys. They had to be here somewhere. If they weren't, our entire plan would fall apart. Just as panic started to set in, my fingers brushed against something. Metallic, the keys! I grabbed them and jammed them into the ignition, praying the old vehicle would start. The engine coughed and sputtered, then roared to life. Relief flooded through me, but there was no time to celebrate. "Jake, get in!" I yelled. As Jake climbed in, I saw Sarah and the others making their way towards us, fighting off scavengers as they came. Tom was bringing up the rear, his shotgun keeping the worst of the attackers at bay. I gunned the engine, the snowplow lurching forward. The scavengers scattered as we bore down on them, the massive blade at the front of the vehicle pushing aside. Abandoned cars and makeshift barriers. "Hold on!" I shouted as we reached our people. I swung the plow around, creating a barrier between our group and the bulk of the scavengers. "Get in the back!" Jake yelled, opening the rear door. Our group piled in, squeezing into the small cabin. I could hear the ping of bullets hitting the plow's metal body. The scavengers had recovered from their initial shock and were now opening fire. With everyone aboard, I slammed the accelerator. The plow surged forward, pushing through the scavengers' barricades like they were made of paper. We burst out of the camp and onto the open street, the sound of gunfire fading behind us. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of hope. We'd done it. We'd escaped. But our troubles were far from over. As we sped through the frozen streets, I could see vehicles in the rearview mirror. The scavengers were in pursuit. "They're following us!" Sarah yelled from the back. I gritted my teeth and pushed the plow harder. The engine whined in protest, clearly not used to this kind of abuse. But we couldn't slow down. Our lives depended on putting as much distance between us and the scavengers as possible. We tore through the city, the plow's blade clearing a path through the snow and ice. Behind us, I could hear the roar of engines as our pursuers gave chase. "Where are we going?" Dr. Reeves asked, his voice tense. I realized I didn't have an answer. In the chaos of our escape, I hadn't thought beyond getting away from the scavengers' camp. Now, as I navigated the icy streets, I tried to think of a destination. That's when I remembered something Karen had mentioned back in the department store. She'd talked about rumors of a safe zone, somewhere the military had managed to secure. "The safe zone," I said, making a decision. "We're heading for the safe zone, but we don't know where it is," Jake pointed out. "No," I admitted, "but it's our best shot. We'll head towards the city center. If there's a safe zone, that's probably where it would be." As we sped towards the heart of the city, the pursuit behind us intensified. I could see the scavengers' vehicles getting closer in the mirror. "They're gaining on us," Tom shouted, peering out the back window. I pushed the plow even harder, but I knew we couldn't outrun them forever. This lumbering vehicle wasn't built for speed. That's when I saw our chance. Up ahead, the road dipped down into an underpass. The entrance was partially blocked by abandoned cars and fallen debris, but I thought we could make it through. "Everyone hold on!" I yelled, aiming the plow straight for the narrow opening. We hit the blockage with a bone-jarring crash. For a terrifying moment, I thought we were stuck, but then the plow's blade did its job, pushing aside the debris. We burst through into the underpass, the sudden darkness momentarily blinding after the bright white of the snow-covered streets. I heard crashes behind us as some of our pursuers tried to follow and collided with the debris, but I knew it wouldn't stop all of them. Curving slightly so I couldn't see the exit, I kept the plow moving, praying we wouldn't encounter any impassable obstacles. Suddenly, Jake grabbed my arm. "Alex, look." I followed his gaze and felt my heart sink. Up ahead, the underpass was flooded. The water had frozen solid, creating a massive ice slick that stretched as far as I could see. We were going too fast to stop. I had a split second to make a decision. I could try to brake, but on this ice, we'd likely spin out of control. Or I could try to power through and hope the plow's weight and momentum would carry us across. I made my choice. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. We hit the ice with a jolt that rattled my teeth. The plow immediately began to slide, all traction lost. I fought with the steering wheel, trying to keep us moving in a straight line. Behind us, I heard screeching tires and the crunch of metal. Our pursuers, unprepared for the sudden ice, were crashing into each other, but we weren't out of danger yet. The plow was sliding faster and faster, spinning slowly as it went. I had no control anymore. We were at the mercy of momentum and the treacherous ice. The far end of the underpass was coming up fast. I could see daylight ahead, but also a pile of wrecked cars blocking most of the exit. "Brace for impact," I yelled, mere seconds before we hit. The crash was deafening. I was thrown forward, then snapped back by my seatbelt. For a moment, everything was a blur of motion and noise. Then, suddenly, stillness. As the dust settled, I blinked, trying to clear my vision. We had smashed through the wreckage and emerged on the other side of the underpass. The plow was battered, steam rising from its crumpled hood, but we were still moving. I looked back. The underpass behind us was a scene of destruction. Wrecked vehicles littered the icy road. There was no sign of pursuit. "Is everyone okay?" I called out, my voice shaky. There were groans and murmured affirmatives from the back. We were battered and bruised, but alive. I guided the damaged plow to the side of the road and finally allowed myself to relax slightly. We had made it. Against all odds, we had escaped, but as the adrenaline faded, new worries set in. The plow was heavily damaged. I wasn't sure how much further it would take us, and we were still in the middle of a frozen city with no clear destination and no supplies. As if reading my thoughts, Dr. Reeves spoke up. "We need to find shelter, and soon. We're all exhausted and night will be falling soon." I nodded, knowing he was right. The escape had taken a lot out of all of us, and the cold was a constant, deadly threat. That's when I noticed something in the distance. Rising above the snow-covered buildings was a plume of smoke. It was faint, barely visible against the gray sky, but it was there. "Look," I said, pointing. "Smoke, that means fire, and fire means people. Or it could mean danger," Tom warned. "We don't know who's out there." He was right, of course. After our encounter with the scavengers, we knew all too well that not everyone left in this frozen world was friendly, but we were out of options. "We have to risk it," I said. "We can't stay out in the open, and the plow isn't going to last much longer. Whatever's producing that smoke is our best chance." There were nervous glances exchanged, but no one argued. We all knew the reality of our situation. I started the plow's engine, wincing at the unhealthy sound it made. As I put it in gear, I silently urged the battered vehicle to hold together for just a little longer. As we set off towards the distant smoke, I couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. We were heading into the unknown, possibly towards friends, possibly towards enemies. But one thing was certain. Our fight for survival in this frozen world was far from over. The plow limped through the snow-covered streets, each rattling cough from its engine making me fear it would be its last. The plume of smoke grew larger as we approached, rising from somewhere in what looked like it had once been a bustling downtown area. As we drew closer, I began to make out more details. The smoke was coming from a large building, what might have once been a hotel or office complex. I could see movement around it, figures going in and out. "Stop here," Tom said as we were about a block away. "We should approach on foot. If they're hostile, we don't want to lose our only transportation." I nodded, bringing the plow to a halt behind a pile of snow-covered rubble that would help conceal it. As we climbed out, the full force of the cold hit us again. The brief time in the relative warmth of the plow had made me almost forget how brutal the temperature was. "How should we do this?" Sarah asked, her breath visible in the frigid air. "I'll go," I said. "I'll approach alone. That way, if they're hostile, the rest of you can get away." Immediately, there were protests. Jake stepped forward. "No, we go together," Dr. Reeves added firmly. "We've made it this far as a group. We're not separating now." I wanted to argue, to insist on protecting them, but I knew they were right. We were stronger together, so with a nod, I agreed. As a group, we cautiously made our way towards the building. As we got closer, I could see that it had once been a grand hotel. Its windows were mostly broken now, replaced by makeshift coverings. The entrance was barricaded, with only a small opening guarded by two figures bundled up against the cold. When we were about 50 yards away, one of the guards spotted us. I saw him raise a rifle, pointing it in our direction. "That's far enough," he shouted. "Who are you and what do you want?" I raised my hands slowly, showing we were unarmed. "We're survivors," I called back. "We're looking for shelter. We saw your smoke." The guards conferred briefly. Then the one who had spoken waved us forward. "Approach slowly," he ordered. "Any sudden moves and we'll open fire." We did as we were told, moving forward with our hands visible. As we got closer, I could see that the guards were wearing a mix of civilian clothes and what looked like police or security uniforms. When we reached them, the lead guard looked us over critically. "Where did you come from?" he asked. "We were students," I explained. "From the university. We've been trying to survive since the freeze hit." The guard's expression softened slightly at the mention of the university. "You've come a long way," he said, "and you're lucky you made it here." "Where exactly is here?" Dr. Reeves asked. The guard gestured to the building behind him. "Welcome to Haven," he said, "one of the last safe zones in the city." A wave of relief washed over me. We had found it. The safe zone we had been hoping for actually existed, but my relief was tempered by caution. I had learned the hard way that in this new world, things were rarely as they seemed. "Can we come in?" I asked, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. The guard hesitated, then nodded. "We'll have to check you over first. Make sure you're not carrying any weapons or diseases, but yes, you can come in." As they led us through the barricade and into the building, I felt a mix of hope and apprehension. We had found shelter, possibly even safety, but I couldn't shake the feeling that our challenges were far from over. The warmth that hit us as we entered the building was almost shocking after so long in the bitter cold. I could feel my frozen limbs starting to tingle painfully as they thawed. Inside, the hotel lobby had been transformed into a makeshift command center. People bustled about, some in uniforms, others in civilian clothes. Maps covered the walls, marked with notations I couldn't understand from a distance. We were led to a side room where we were thoroughly searched and examined by what appeared to be a doctor. The process was invasive and uncomfortable, but I understood the need for caution. Finally, we were cleared and brought before a stern-looking woman who introduced herself as Captain Hernandez. "Welcome to Haven," she said, her voice crisp and authoritative. "You're lucky to have made it here. Not many have in the past few days." "What is this place?" I asked, looking around at the bustling activity. Captain Hernandez's expression was grim. "This is one of the last strongholds of civilization in the city," she said. "We've managed to secure this building and a few blocks around it. We have power, thanks to some generators, and we've stockpiled food and medical supplies, but resources are running low, and the situation outside is getting worse by the day." She went on to explain that they had lost contact with other cities days ago. As far as they knew, similar safe zones might exist elsewhere, but they had no way to reach them. "What about the government? The military?" Dr. Reeves asked. Captain Hernandez shook her head. "We haven't had any contact with higher authorities in days. For all we know, we might be all that's left." The weight of her words settled over us like a heavy blanket. We had found safety, yes, but it was precarious safety at best. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now," Captain Hernandez said, "you become part of our community. Everyone here works. We need every able body to help maintain our defenses, manage our resources, and hopefully find a way to survive this ice age." As she assigned us our roles and showed us where we would be staying, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. Relief at having found shelter and relative safety, fear of the uncertain future that lay ahead, and a gnawing worry about the friends we had left behind in the tunnels beneath the university. As I lay down that night in a real bed for the first time in what felt like ages, I knew that our journey was far from over. We had survived the first week of this ice age apocalypse, but the real test of our survival and our humanity. In the darkness of the room, listening to the howling wind outside and the soft breathing of my exhausted companions, I made a silent vow. Somehow, some way, I would find a way to rescue our friends, and together we would find a way to not just survive, but to live in this new frozen world. As I drifted off to sleep, my mind filled with plans and possibilities, I had no idea of the challenges that awaited us in the days to come. But I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened, we would face it together. The days at Haven blurred, together in a routine of work, planning, and constant vigilance. Each of us was assigned tasks crucial to the survival of the community. I found myself working on the engineering team, helping to maintain the generators that provided our precious heat and power. Jake was assigned to the scavenging teams, venturing out into the frozen city to search for supplies. Sarah, with her quick mind and organizational skills, became part of the resource management team. Despite the relative safety of Haven, the high threat of the ever-present cold and dwindling resources hung over us like a dark cloud. Captain Hernandez ran the safe zone with military precision, but even she couldn't hide the worry in her eyes during our daily briefings. It was during one of these briefings, about a week after our arrival, that everything changed again. We've detected unusual seismic activity, Captain Hernandez announced, her face grim. Dr. Chen, our geologist, believes it might be related to the rapid freezing of the groundwater. A murmur of concern rippled through the assembled group. Dr. Chen, a small, bespectacled man, stepped forward. The extreme cold is causing the water in the soil to freeze and expand at an unprecedented rate, he explained. This is putting immense pressure on the underground structures of the city. If this continues, we could see massive sinkholes forming, possibly even the collapse of entire city blocks. The implications were terrifying. Haven, our sanctuary, could literally crumble beneath our feet. What can we do? I asked, my mind already racing with potential solutions. Captain Hernandez's expression was grim. We need to find a more stable location, somewhere with solid bedrock that can withstand this freezing process. But where? Jake interjected. And how would we move everyone? That's when I remembered something, a detail from my old life that suddenly seemed crucially important. The university, I said, all eyes turning to me. There's an old Cold War-era bunker beneath the science building. It was built into the bedrock. If it's still intact, it could be the safe haven we need. Captain Hernandez's eyes lit up with the first glimmer of hope I'd seen in days. Are you sure about this? I nodded. I remember hearing about it during freshman orientation. It was supposed to be able to withstand a nuclear attack. If anything could survive this ice age, it would be that bunker. Even if it exists, Dr. Chen cautioned, reaching it would be extremely dangerous. The university is miles from here, through territory we know is crawling with hostile groups. I'll go, I said without hesitation. I know the campus. I can find the bunker. Jake immediately stepped forward. I'm going too. Captain Hernandez considered for a moment, then nodded. All right, we'll assemble a small team, but understand, this is a scouting mission only. You're to assess the viability of this bunker and report back. Do not engage with hostiles unless absolutely necessary. The next few hours were a flurry of preparation. We were equipped with cold weather gear, weapons, and enough supplies for a 3-day round trip. As we prepared, I couldn't help but think of our friends we had left behind in the tunnels beneath the university. If they had survived, could they have found the bunker? The thought gave me renewed determination. Our team consisted of 5 people, Jake and me, 2 of Haven's security, personnel named Rodriguez and Chen, and Dr. Emily Frost, a structural engineer who could assess the bunker's integrity. As we stood at the barricade ready to venture out into the frozen wasteland that had once been our city, Captain Hernandez gave us a final briefing. Remember, your primary objective is to locate and assess the bunker. Avoid engagement with any hostile forces. If you're not back in 3 days, we'll assume the worst. With a final nod, we stepped out into the biting cold. The wind howled around us, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Visibility was poor, the world beyond a few dozen yards obscured by swirling snow. We moved cautiously through the streets, alert for any sign of movement. The city was eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the creaking of ice-laden structures and the occasional distant crash of collapsing buildings. As we approached the university campus, tension grew within our group. This was where we had last encountered dangers might be lurking in the frozen ruins of our former school. Suddenly, Rodriguez held up a hand, signaling us to stop. Movement ahead, he whispered, pointing to a partially collapsed building. We ducked. Behind a snow-covered car, weapons at the ready. Through the swirling snow, I could make out figures moving among the ruins. They didn't seem to have noticed us yet. Scavengers, Jake whispered. I squinted, trying to get a better look. That's when I saw something that made my heart leap. One of the figures was wearing a familiar jacket, one I recognized from our group that had been trapped in the tunnels. Wait, I hissed, grabbing Rodriguez's arm as he raised his rifle. I think those are our friends. Before anyone could stop me, I stood up and called out, Mike, Sarah, is that you? The figures froze, then one of them turned in our direction. Alex? A familiar voice called back. Alex, is that really you? Relief flooded through me as I recognized Mike's voice. We rushed forward, caution momentarily forgotten in the joy of reunion. It was indeed Mike and Sarah, along with 3 others from our original group. They looked haggard and exhausted, but very much alive. As we exchanged quick hugs and explanations, Dr. Frost reminded us of our pressing mission. We need to find that bunker, she urged. We can catch up once we're somewhere safer. Mike nodded. We know where it is, he said. We've been using it as a shelter, but we've been running low on supplies. We were out scavenging when you found us. With our group now nearly doubled in size, we made our way to the science building. The structure was partially collapsed, but Mike led us to a hidden entrance that descended deep underground. As we entered the bunker, I was struck by how well preserved it was. Thick concrete walls, reinforced doors, and a complex air filtration system had kept it intact despite the chaos above. Dr. Frost immediately set about examining the structure, her face growing more excited by the minute. This is perfect, she declared after a thorough inspection. The walls are thermally insulated, the structure is sound, and there's enough space to house hundreds of people. people. A spark of hope ignited in my chest. We had found it, a true safe haven that could withstand the Ice Age. But our joy was short-lived. As we were discussing plans to contact Haven and begin the relocation, a thunderous boom shook the bunker. Dust rained down from the ceiling as the tremors continued. "What's happening?" Sarah cried out. Dr. Chen's face was pale. "It's what I feared. The freezing process is accelerating. The ground above us is shifting, possibly collapsing." Another violent shake sent us all stumbling. Alarms began to blare throughout the bunker. "We need to get out of here," Rodriguez shouted over the noise. "If the entrance collapses, we'll be trapped." We rushed for the exit, the bunker continuing to shake around us. As we emerged into the frozen world above, a horrifying sight greeted us. The ground was literally breaking apart, massive cracks appearing in the ice-covered streets. Buildings were toppling like dominoes, unable to withstand the violent movement of the earth. "Run!" I yelled, urging everyone towards what looked like a more stable area. We fled through the disintegrating campus, narrowly avoiding falling debris and opening chasms. The very world seemed to be coming apart around us. As we reached the edge of the campus, I looked back. The science building, along with our hope for a safe haven, disappeared into a gaping sinkhole. We didn't stop running until we were several blocks away, finally pausing to catch our breath in the shelter of an old parking garage. As the dust settled and the tremors subsided, the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. Our mission had failed. The bunker was gone, and now we were stuck miles from Haven, in a city that was literally falling apart beneath our feet. I looked at the faces of my companions, seeing my own fear and uncertainty reflected back at me. We had survived the first week of the Ice Age apocalypse, but now, as the world continued to change in ways we couldn't have imagined, I realized our true test of survival was just beginning. The question now wasn't just how to survive the cold, but how to survive a world that was fundamentally changing, becoming more hostile and unpredictable with each passing day. As we huddled together in the cold, I knew that the decisions we made in the coming hours and days would determine not just our fate, but possibly the fate of all those counting on us back at Haven. The weight of responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. We had no safe haven, dwindling supplies, and a city crumbling around us. Yet giving up wasn't an option. Somehow, we had to find a way forward, a way to survive in this ever-changing frozen world. As I looked at my companions, I saw the same determination. We had come this far together, and together we would face whatever challenges lay ahead. The Ice Age had changed everything, but it hadn't broken our spirit. Not yet. And as long as we had that, we had hope. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. "All right," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need a new plan. We can't go back to Haven empty-handed, and we can't stay here. Any ideas?" And with that, we began to plan our next move, ready to face whatever this frozen world would throw at us next. Our story was far from over. In fact, it felt like it was only just beginning.